influences on Indian food. India's culinary heritage is a rich amalgamation of flavors and influences of people who came and settled in her fertile lands over the years. Mughal and Portuguese influences in Indian cuisines are well known across the world. However, there exist many other foreign influences in India's culinary repertoire, as well as that remain to be explored. As waves of settlers came to India as traders or asylum seekers, invaders, and missionaries, they brought with them their recipes, ingredients, and flavors, which slowly merged into the greater gastronomic tapestry of India. Today, we will delve into a search for these pockets of foreign influences in Indian cuisine and how they helped evolve the Indian palate. From the eclectic Parsi dishes to the unique Mopla cuisine of North Kerala, the stews of Christian Syrians from South Kerala to the Chinese and Anglo-Indian influences in the East. We will learn about the evolution of India's culinary heritage with our panel of experts. I warmly welcome Mr. and Mrs. Musa, custodians of the charming old colonial bungalow, Aisha Manzil, just outside Tellicherry. Mr. and Mrs. Musa are experts on all details of the Mopla cuisine prevalent in North Kerala. At their property, they take great care to make the guests acquainted with the ingredients and techniques used to prepare this cuisine. If I am correct, Mrs. Musa has also written a book about their cuisine. Then we have Mrs. Nimmi Paul. Mrs. Nimmi Paul is a professional chef and a cookery instructor for over 20 years. And along with her husband, Paul, she conducts cooking sessions and classes on Syrian Christian traditional recipes in Kerala. She teaches the nuances of traditional recipes with great care and is a champion for the preservation of age-old techniques. She also has a cookbook to her credit. Then we have Reha Mitra Dalal. Reha is an archaeologist by education and training, but is now a blogger, food writer, and home baker. She also runs Katie's Kitchen, a catering firm specializing in Parsi cuisine. She is based out of Mumbai. Last but not the least, we have Poorna Banerjee. Poorna is a food and travel writer, a restaurant consultant, and social media strategist from Calcutta. She is deeply interested in culinary history and has been blogging for over 10 years about food and travel based on her extensive explorations across the world. So let's begin our conversation with this interesting panel we have today. The beginning of the confluence of food and culture. This is my first topic. And my first question is to you, Poorna. Which culinary influence is the earliest one can say to India?
I think Poorna has got disconnected.
Poorna is not there? Okay. So
She's back. She's back.
Poorna, can you hear us?
No, she's not on the scene.
Let me ask Mr. and Mrs. Musa. Mopla cuisine has a curious blend of Arabic, Portuguese, and Dutch recipes and traditions. Can you tell us a bit more about the origins and evolution of the cuisine and the different influences that it has witnessed over the years? Mr. Musa, over to you.
Yeah, so of course, our cuisine, there is a lot of influence of Arab, Portuguese, as well as North India. That is something on later research I found out. And also the Mughal, that is Persian. So it's as old as, it's more than 500 years. Our cuisine is older than more than 500 years. So when we talk about Portuguese influence, the most interesting part is we have a starter course called Buntamala, which is made with egg yolk and sugar, nothing else, which is the most important part of a feast, and a feast is incomplete without that. And it is a starter course and it's a sweet course. And the story, as per the story about in the 14th century or something like that, I believe in Portugal there was overproduction of egg and the egg was going wasted. So they decided to invent something and utilize that egg from being wasted, and they ended up in making a dish out of which is purely out of the egg yolk and sugar, which they introduced to almost all the places they went, including Goa. But the only difference we have now at the moment is this Mutamala credit is fully for the Mapla community. It is generally believed all over the world as if it is something invented by the Maplas itself, and it is something only they can do and they only know to do it. But I understand even in Goa it was there. Even now for some feast, but known by a different name. But now the thing is, we have preserved it so well that we could end up claiming that it is purely ours, and there is nobody who can really prove it, or I mean disprove it, that all your claims are wrong. So that way we are slightly on the advantageous side. So Mapla, when you talk about Mapla cuisine, the signature dish of the Mapla cuisine is this Mutamala, which is made with the egg yolk and sugar syrup, nothing else. And at some point, if possible, we'll show you the picture from our book when our next turn comes. Okay?
Sure. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much for that. My next question is to Mrs. Nimi Paul. Would you like to tell us how the Syrian Christian cuisine came to being, and what are the salient features of this cuisine, and how different is it from other Kerala cuisines?
Okay. It's a difficult question to answer truthfully because see, the Syrian Christian food came into being with the European colonial influence in our culture. See, we were all Hindus at one time, and it is with the European influence the changes came into our diet. And so I would say it is a European influence, yeah.
So when you say European, would you say more Portuguese or Dutch or?
Yeah, it's more, I would say highlight on the Portuguese, and certainly the Dutch, the British. For example, if I talk about the mean pollichadu, there is a French version also of it. And now, most important, everybody would like to highlight or talk about is like one of the most popular, iconic dish of mine is the mean molly.
Yes.
Yeah, mean molly. Everybody, it's never failed recipe. And most of my guests, they appreciate the mean molly the best. So, and I would say it is more we have been, as I was saying, we have been Hindus at one time, and every recipe that we have is common in every home. But the difference I would like to share is in each area, we use ingredients which is available in each area. So depending on the availability, the ingredients vary, the method vary. Yeah.
So would you say the Syrian Christian cuisine is more milder compared to other?
It's much more, I would say it's much more subtle in flavor. So the compliment I always get from my guests is, maybe your food, your recipe, they complement the food, they do not dominate. Your spices are complementing the food and not dominating the food. And I think that is the highlight of the Syrian cuisine. Of course, we do use spices, but it is used in a very subtle way. It could be because of the foreign influence in our food. That's why I think it's not. I think that is a reason.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Rhea, my next question is to you. How would you define Parsi food, and what are the salient features, iconic dishes?
So, Parsi food is essentially the food of the Parsis, and I think most people know that Parsis came as refugees around 1200 years ago. They settled in Gujarat, and now since the cuisine, a lot of people have this perception that it's Persian cuisine in India. So since the Parsis have been around for nearly 1200 years, it is no longer a Persian cuisine, it's absolutely an Indian cuisine.
Yeah.
So there are just, I would say, hints of their Parsi roots in the food, in the sense of, certain things like a love for garnishes, a love for using fruit and dry fruit in the food, the preparation of pulaus instead of biryanis like many other communities, and stuff like that. So uh, it is like I always say this whenever I speak about Parsi food, that it is an Indian cuisine. It's as Indian as, dal chawal and whatever else, because the Parsis have been around for more than 1,000 years. So they are very much desi. Um, I am a Bengali married into a Parsi household. So, I got to see the cuisine as an outsider. I haven't grown up eating this. And I realized that there is not a massive variety, at least in the urban areas, of the food. The tables on a regular day, on an everyday basis, is fairly frugal. There will be one main dish, there will be a rice with it, and you eat that. Maybe there might be a small side dish of cutlets or something. So daily fare is fairly simple. It's not very elaborate in the sense of there's not a lot of variety. Celebration food, on the other hand, then it's like, when it's party time, you pull out all the stops, you bring out the beautiful chinaware, you bring out all the beautiful platters and everything, and you lay out a real feast.
So
So yeah.
would you say Parsi food is incomplete without eggs?
So Parsis, yes, legendarily, they love eggs, and most people will joke that give a Parsi any dish as such, and he will put eggs on it, and make a meal out of it. And funnily, in fact, just this afternoon for lunch, my husband and I, we had yesterday's bhindi sabji was left over. It was, that neither here nor there amount of leftovers.
Make
So
some
he
egg.
just, so he spread it on a pan, cracked couple of eggs, fetke, and we had a lovely meal out of that. So yes, eggs are a big part of the Parsi table as such, and of course we don't use eggs in every single thing, but we are quite capable of putting eggs in every single thing.
Right. I wonder if Purna is back.
Yes, I'm back. Sorry
Okay,
about this.
fantastic. So, Purna, my question to you now: what are the earliest, as a food historian, what are the earliest influences on our cuisine, Indian cuisine? And can you tell us about? Then I have a next question for you as well. So let me answer you that.
Go ahead. Okay. So let me give you a little bit of an example of how our cuisine has been built. Okay. So if you're looking at a country like India, India has been influenced from all sides because we are basically a peninsula, right? So our influences come from every part of the world, literally,
Yes.
because our sea routes and our land routes are all open. The earliest influence that I would say that happened in Bengal, for example, was actually not from the north, but from the southeast and far east. Okay, so if you look at the way we are cooking things and the things that we generally eat every single day, then you will see that there is a severe influence of Southeast Asia over any other parts of the world for us. This is specifically because in ancient India, some of the major ports were around the Bay of Bengal. A port that is now gone, which is called Tamralipta.
Tamluk.
Was possibly where it is the closest to Pataliputra, Patna.
Yes.
Right. So what I have always believed is that in Bengali cuisine, when you eat, we eat in a way which is very similar to the rest of Southeast Asia over anywhere.
I think Purna's connection is a bit poor.
Yeah, she's frozen again today.
Yeah, so basically she's trying to tell us that the Southeast Asian cuisine is the closest to the way Bengalis eat, really. And I think the key ingredient being fish there.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah,
you're
especially
back.
if you're looking at the cooking technique and if you see the way people cook,
then you'll realize that a lot of times we carry with us, especially our mothers, our grandmothers, our parents, they carried with us the technique and then implemented it in with the local ingredients, whatever we had. So if you can carry the technique around with you, then you'll realize that there are striking similarities between the food that we eat here in Bengal today, as well as parts of Southeast Asia. The basic concept of the food is very similar. As in, we eat something tangy, and then to mellow it down, we add something creamy, and then the result is somewhere in between. Or, we steam something, or we wrap something. And these techniques are the most important factor for me. I feel that these techniques are universal. People all around the world will adopt the same technique and utilize whatever they have locally. Now, I can give a very simple example of the dumpling. So all over the Southeast Asia, all over through Europe, you have the concept of the dumpling. In Sweden and in Russia, you have the piroshki, you have the Mongols call it guz, then we have the momo in Nepal and Tibet, and then we have all sorts of dumplings, the baozi, the shumai, the different kinds of dumplings all over Southeast Asia. In Bengal, we have something very simple called the pithe, which is sort of similar. I'm not going to say they're exactly the same, but mostly sweet dumplings are very similar. So personally speaking, I feel that whenever I look at food, it is such a huge amount of unrecorded history that we have, that the ways of measuring it is actually very different from a normal archaeological excavation. In here, we rather look at recorded history from people, as in what generations of our parents, our grandparents, and their parents have been telling them when it comes to food habits, eating patterns, recipes. These are all actually preservation of history, because these are all preservation of techniques that we have to look at. So for Bengal, Southeast Asia has been a massive influence from day one. And since Kolkata is a comparatively, relatively new city compared to other cities of India, especially because Kolkata is just over 320 years old, which is a child compared to that, a history of, let's say, a Delhi or a Banaras. I feel that Kolkata also has been able to absorb a lot more migration cuisine than any other major city of India, specifically because it was primarily created as a port and as a trading hub.
It was a business hub.
It's a trading hub. So if it's a trading hub, you will have people from different walks of the world coming to you, and it will be also much more susceptible for people to kind of get more and more influence without any extra, what's the word I'm looking for here? Extra hang-ups. Yeah, hang-ups. Like a lot of people here ask me very happily that, you guys have so many different kinds of street food. All of the street foods are odes to different parts of the world. And that's really nice. It's really nice to know that we have the capability of adapting from so many different cultures.
Fascinating. This is fascinating. So Calcutta is also known for its Chinatown, and it was the first city which had a huge Chinese community there. So tell us a little bit about the evolution of the Chinese cuisine in Calcutta.
Okay. So this actually has a really cool and funny story. So the first story that you'll have to hear about is this poor man called Tong Achiu, who came to India to set up a sugar mill. Unfortunately, this man's ship got his shipwrecked somewhere close to Kolkata, not exactly Kolkata. And he kind of literally nearly drowned, and then he was found somewhere near what is now known as Ochipur. Now, Ochipur wasn't Ochipur until unless Tong Achiu came and gave it that name. And the British at that point of time, headed by Warren Hastings, gave him 650 bigha of Jumi at that point of time, which was like a pretty big deal, to set up his sugar mill. Now, this is kind of ironic given the fact that India...
It's correct.
He's frozen again. So Poona is telling us a fascinating story about,
the shipwreck and the Chinese man.
yes,
The idea of
Suspense ke
introducing,
moment. There she's back.
introduce, sorry. sorry. How much did you hear?
So you were at 650 bighas
Yeah,
of
so-
land.
Yeah, so after Warren Hastings did that, so he gave it to set up a sugar mill where it would be like white sugar farming. Okay. And because
oh dear, we've lost her again.
unfortunately we did give the chance to her and oh dear. Can you hear me? Can you hear me
It's
now?
getting garbled very often.
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, right. So what had happened is the King Harshavardhana was the one who kind of went and sent his envoys to the Chinese emperor to get them some sugar first, because the first versions of unrefined sugar was actually coming from India and then it was going to China. But Tongachu and the Chinese, they actually refined sugar. They made sugar white, and then they came back to India to set up a sugar mill. And it was really funny because this is the point where people were actually trying their best to get that whitest of all white sugar, and there was an obsession over white. So that was really fun because now when he came, Warren Hastings hesitantly gave him a 650 bigha jumi to start a sugar mill. Unfortunately, by that point of time, he was rather fatigued, and it is rumored that he had brought a wife, but she died, or whatever happened to her, nobody knows, because he did marry a local woman who was known as Teli Bibi, and then he set up the little village of Ochipur, where the Chinese people sort of pray. Now, you'll have to understand that China is a vast country. It is not by any means a small country, and like India, it also has different regions. It has multiple regions around for China, and depending on what skills you were good at, you would come and join the community. So in Kolkata, there were primarily ancient Kolkata, I would say, because this is in the 1800s and early 1900s. That's ancient to us, not ancient to anyone else but us, because we are a very new city. but the point is that, so we had four communities primarily. The first one being the Cantonese, who were sort of known as the ones who were the carpenters, the people who would work with wood. And they were pretty, at that point of time, high on the stature because they also had money. And also because Canton was pretty close to Kolkata, if you are looking at the sea route. The second one was the Hubei province people. The people from Hubei who came were primarily dentists. So at one point of time, Chinese doctors were all the rage, and especially dentists, because Chinese dentists apparently knew how to extract teeth without hurting people.
Yes.
Now, this was significant for a lot of people. And then came the Shanghai people, people who were actually laundromat makers and people who had these Chinese laundries. So at some point of time in the Second World War, near the Second World War, Chinese laundries kind of blew up all over the scene, and you will get a lot of examples of this on the novels at that point of time, especially these suspense novels, which would all talk about gory deaths in Chinatown and how the yellow-faced ones were the villains, etc. So sorry about the detour here, but the fourth one, which is very important and the most important factor, I would say, is the Hakka community. Now, the Hakka community was the ones who had initially associated with leather working and tanneries. And these leather working and tanneries gave them a very big edge on everyone else, because this was the kind of job that not a lot of people were very comfortable doing. Okay. So the fact that they came and they initiated a lot of tanneries around Kolkata was something that was a massive of massive importance, and therefore the Hakka influence in food it sort of got a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, it got a lot of priority in Kolkata. In fact, Kolkata's major two Chinese influence in food are Hakka and Cantonese. So people of Kolkata sort of welcomed the Chinese community. They kind of adopted them.
Right. So we've kind of lost Purna again. My
No,
my
I'm
next.
fine, but it's just that
You're here.
I just finished.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Purna. I didn't realize that you had frozen, or was it over? Right.
No,
So
I'm sorry about the internet connection right now.
so thank you. Thank you so much for that insightful introduction to the Chinese influence and how they came and settled in, how four different communities actually contributed to the influence on the food. That's just fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there was also reverse influence on the foreign cuisines when they visited here. For instance, the Anglo-Indian cuisine is a huge reversal. The British dishes became Indian in so many ways. So Rhea, my next question to you is about the adaptation in ingredients and cooking methods that were made on coming to India. So when the Parsis came to India, some of the original ingredients like the fruits, the berries they use, or the flowers of the old cuisines are not obviously not easily available here. And how were they substituted, and how much of a role did the Indian influence have on the Parsi food?
So, like I said earlier, Parsi food is an Indian phenomenon.
Yes, absolutely.
So the Parsis, when they came as refugees. So when you immigrate or you go to a new country as a refugee, you are not exactly carrying everything possible, and you haven't really prepared for, and also you're coming to a new place. You don't really know what you're going to find there. So they came here, they sought asylum. And there is this beautiful little story about how when the first lot landed, the leader of that group uh, went and met the local chieftain, and the local chieftain asking for asylum, like, give us space in your land to live. And so that local chieftain held out this bowl which was absolutely full to the brim with milk, and he said, my land is like this bowl of milk. It is absolutely full, so there is no place for you, basically. So this the leader of this group reached into his robes and took out cubes of sugar, and he dropped the sugar cube into the bowl of milk and said, like the sugar has blended into this milk, so will we blend into your land and your people. And we will not only blend in, like this sugar has made that milk better, we will also make your land and your community and everything better. The only thing they said that they would like to hang on to is their religion, because they had obviously fled from Persia to preserve their religion. So this is how the Parsis, as such, this is an oral tradition that has been handed down, this story. And I think it's quite a lovely story. And I do firmly believe that the Parsis, in the 1200 odd years that they've been here, have certainly sweetened the milk that is India. So now, talking about ingredients, like I said, obviously they didn't bring a whole lot of stuff with them, but what they brought was ideas, because ideas you carry in your head, so they are with you, so you have very strong memories of what you ate, what you've grown up eating, what you're used to. Now, the land they came to, India, is extremely fertile, extremely rich in ingredients and produce. So it was not like they didn't encounter familiar things. They encountered, in the variety there was familiarity. uh, like, for example, they really liked fruits. They might not have found the identical fruits to what they were used to back home, but they found a lot of similar ingredients. uh, let's talk about, say, the green vegetables. So uh, salads and fresh vegetables are very, very commonly consumed in Persia. and they are abundantly available here also. So there were differences in the details, but not in general in the ingredients available. Let me give you another example. Fish was very popular. Fish is abundantly available here. So while you might be having the classic Persian white fish over there, here you found different varieties of fish. So fish as an ingredient group was still available. The difference was in the details.
Yeah.
Uh, Say in the last 20 years or so, we are seeing that suddenly you have access to every possible ingredient under the sun, thanks to the internet, thanks to India easing up on its import laws and export laws and all of that. The economy has been opened up a lot as of the last 15-20 years. So for example, there is this very famous iconic dish called the berry pulao, which is very popular in Bombay. And originally, the berry pulao is supposed to have zeresk berries. Now, around 20 years ago, you would find that restaurants served the berry pulao with cranberries because that was what was available. But as of recent years, zeresk berries are very easily available in the markets. And so the restaurants now make it with the proper zeresk berries. So adaptation happened when it was necessary, and now the trend also is to hark back to your roots and try to be as original as possible, to dig out the old recipes and recreate them as uh, correctly as possible. So yeah, so now we are sort of shifting back, going back as far as possible. Of course, we are not going back to the cuisine of Persia 1200 years ago. What we are going back to just now is more or less the cuisine of the Parsis, what they cooked in the villages, and say maybe 100 years ago. That's about it. So ingredients, like Purna was saying, you carry the technique with you, and
Yeah.
then you adapt the technique to whatever is available.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we still make
That's
pulaus. Pulaus,
Yeah.
rice was a precious commodity in Persia, and it was a celebration food. And in India, when the Parsis got here, rice was available in abundance. It was not as expensive and more easily accessible. So even today, pulao is a big part of our celebration. So even for a Sunday lunch, if say the whole family is getting together, it is very likely, like my mother-in-law would always make a pulao. She would have this huge platter of pulao, and it would be lavishly garnished with lots of onion birista. She would put dry fruits on it. She would
Yeah.
obviously there would be eggs, boiled eggs, all scattered all over the thing, and she would add potatoes because the family loves potatoes in their pulao. So you remember the technique, and then you build it with
Adapt.
what's available. Yes.
Thank you so much, Ria, for that. My next question is to Mr. Musa about biryanis. So, how is the biryani in North Kerala different from those we find in other parts of India? And that's I think, one of the iconic dishes of North Kerala.
Yes. Biryani, of North Kerala, especially Talisheri, where we belong to, is very famous. And mutton biryani is the most famous, and it is mainly the way it is cooked. The method of cooking makes it very different, because we make the masala. Of course, we have a very secret masala used for mutton biryani, along with other spices. And then after making the masala, we make the rice separate. Then we take this rice and put it on the cooked masala, and we put it on dum. Dum means there'll be fire at the bottom, as well as there'll be charcoal fire on top. And after, leave it there for some time, and in the meantime, all the flavor from the masala will go into the rice, and that makes that biryani exotic. And recently there was a biryani tweet fight between ministers. I suppose you all remember my friend Amitabh Khan and all that. And he was saying that the best biryani in the world is the biryani in Talasheri. Then
Yes.
one minister was saying our biryani in Hyderabad is the best in the world, like that. then we never had a chance. Otherwise, we would have said the best biryani in the world. We make it. Nobody else can make it. Okay. So biryani, of course, Hyderabad biryani is very famous because it's so well promoted. Whereas our biryani is not promoted so well in past. But now there is a lot of promotions about our biryani that the famous master chef came all the way to us and they did a story called the Biryani Journeys of Malabar. I mean, our chef Sanjeev Kapoor, which was last year and it is there on the YouTube. So biryani, our biryani, mutton biryani, I would say is something you cannot beat or you cannot compare with other biryanis of India. And the rice we use, we don't use basmati. We have a small biryani grain rice which is grown on the hills. It's called kaima, or which is called jeera rice because it's like jeera.
Thin, small.
Yeah, that is about the biryani. And it is when it comes to serving also, you serve the rice separate and the masala separate. And you put the rice in the plate first, and you put the masala on top. Then you mix and eat it. So that way you make the Talisheri biryani is very different. Even it is different from the biryani which is made in Calicut. Calicut and Talisheri is just 1 hour apart. And of course, the people in Calicut are also from the Mapla community. But there were different ingredients altogether, and different cooking method altogether, and different flavor for the finished product altogether. But nothing to beat Talisheri biryani. Okay?
So you're not going to tell us the secret ingredient that you use.
We have the garam masala, which we make our own garam masala, which Faisa will tell you. Please go ahead.
8 spices, the 3 jeeras, that is the aniseed, the cumin seed, and the sajira, caraway seed. And then we put cardamom, cloves, cinnamon, 3. And then nutmeg and mace. No star anise, only 8.
Okay.
In proportion.
Yeah.
That is blood. That is blood.
We should never roast the garam masala. You should always dry it in the sun, or you should keep it in any hot lid. When we cook the rice or something, you can keep it on the lid and dry it.
What is the is it equal measure? What is the proportion? If you don't mind me asking you, Musa. What is the proportion? That's
A tablespoon of cardamom, cloves, cinnamon, and then
what is the measures, the proportion of the spices? That is the secret.
Shall I say?
Yeah.
1 tablespoon of cardamom, cloves, cinnamon pieces, and then mace. For that, one mistake.
Nutmeg.
Nutmeg, 1 nutmeg, and 1 nutmeg. Then the 3 aniseed, cumin seed, and sajira. You must be careful that the sajira and cumin is little strong, so it should never be moved. Aniseed is more, we make the other things equal. So you should be careful with the 2 other jeeras.
So thank you so much. We now know the secret ingredient. Guys, it's not secret anymore. We are live on Facebook. This is not secret
Probably a
anymore.
lot of recipes will be coming up soon with of authentic biryani.
We will send Ria and Purna her book and one for Nimi also.
Oh, I will be most
Oh,
grateful.
that would be wonderful.
But we'll collect the address from your office and we'll courier them.
Yes, I'd be happy to share. So we'll post the recipes, I think, on our, we'll share the recipes with all the participants of your famous biryani. I think that would be huge.
And I'll just show you, this is a book.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Can you see?
Malabar, yes.
Yes.
So just before you switch over to the next person, what is inside that steel bowl is what you call fried mussels, stuffed and fried mussels, which is purely our invention, which has got no influence of
My next question was about shellfish to you, because Kerala is on the coastline. So did coastal food does it have a huge influence on the cuisine?
Yes. Like biryani, as I told you about biryani, with the fish we make lot of things. One of the main things one of the most talked about dishes called fish patris. Patris are bread are called patris. So it is stuffed patris which is steamed. And it has got a very special masala which you can see it in our book. That is something everybody rave about once they have tasted it, about our fish paratha. My friend Amitabh Khan says fish paratha. Wherever he goes, he talks about fish parathas, even now. So one of the main thing is that out of the fish. Then with the mussels, this ari, this you call it ari kadika. Ari means rice, kadika means mussels. So if you happen to meet somebody from somebody who had gone to Talasheri, the first thing they'll ask you is, did you eat ari kadika? Because Talasheri is so famous for that even people living in England and Dubai, they take it frozen and leave it in the freezer and fry as and when they want and eat it. It is a delicacy and purely an invention of the Mapla community. Then Purna was talking about dumplings earlier in her talk. We make lovely dumplings with mussels, and it's called mussels dumplings, and it is mind-blowing. Once you start eating, you go on eating and finally end up that plays havoc with your whole system. So the dumplings we make with mussels also is very, very famous. Then we come to the prawns. The most famous dish of our prawns is called tamarind prawns, which is published in all the international magazines and all the international cookbooks, and everybody rave about it. It is, of course, made with prawns and all the other ingredients like chili powder, turmeric, there's ginger garlic and all that, and tamarind, and it is cooked in earthen pots. And more number of days you keep, it becomes more and more tastier. Like you have the wines kept for years together. So tamarind prawns, yes, it'll be better, and you really relish it if it is after 2 or 3 days. You shouldn't put it in the fridge. You have to every night boil it, and when it is cooked, keep it in a closed thing and have it next year. And nothing to beat that. And it can go with anything. That is about the shellfish. Now that so many dishes are there we make with shellfish and the fish as well. But about the shell, about the fish, when we talk, we always make it a point to talk about that fish patris, which is steamed. Which you find only in very special homes. That is about the influence of fish. There are a lot of things, nothing is coming from the back of the mind. So that's about the fish part.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, right.
Thank you, Mr. Musa, on that. And my question, similar question to Mrs. Nimi Paul, is that what are the key ingredients of the Syrian Christian cuisine, and how was the food adjusted or adapted to the locally available ingredients?
I think the two have gone off the line. It's okay.
We can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me. See, Syrian Christian cuisine, it's the, as I told you earlier, is the colonial or the European influence in our cuisine. So traditionally we were Hindus at one time, and then we had the European, the missionaries who came and brought in a lot of introduction, and using our common available ingredients, recipes have been changed. So for example, if I say about we use a term roast, which is, if you look at the foreign roast, it's not the original roast. It is just a term that has come in. A lot of terms have been used, but it is not exactly, the techniques are different. It's a different technique used. And when we use a term roast, we would say it is more braised chicken or a broiled chicken. So we broil the chicken, we broil duck, and but the term often referred as roast. Similarly, we have a lot of terms like for example, the molly, the stew.
The stew, yes.
Yeah, the stew. The stew
is not the same as the Western stew people know.
No, it's not the Western stew. It is just slow cooking, and I would say it is just why the term stew. I think that's what I feel. It is the missionary influence or the colonial influence. The terms have come. So for example, what I often tell my guests is, we often use the term madam, for which we say madama, and we use the term sahib, for which is sahib. So similarly, terms like that have come into our food also.
Yeah.
Got it?
So,
Yeah. The
So-
terms have come in. Yeah. Ask me, lovely.
Yeah, no, so that's interesting because roast doesn't necessarily mean the
no,
traditional Western roast, and stew doesn't necessarily mean the traditional Western stew that we know. So it's got Kerala's stew, and roast is its own version of it with the local ingredients adapted.
Yeah, only the term or only the term is still relevant there, but the techniques, okay, like as Ria and Purna was saying, we too have dumplings. It's very common. We have dumplings also. For example, I'm sure Musa is also doing it. The Kolkata, it is a dumpling which is stuffed with sweetened coconut, and similarly. But if you ask me about the Western influence or the foreign influence, I would say very few dishes. Okay, so we would make something called what I would like to share is we do what we call the shepherd's pie. Okay, as a child, my mother for dinner it was always a baked dish. Maybe on a weekend, every day. Syrian Christian cuisine often we have very simple, very light food. It's not heavy. It doesn't depend on whether how affluent you are. We like to be on a very low key. Our diet is very low key. I would say very simple. But on a weekend or when the children all come together for holidays, the mother of the house, or at least I would say my mother would make. She would call it a shepherd's pie, but it was not a shepherd's pie. It was a cottage pie because it was beef that was used, and all the meat was cooked with all the beautiful spices in it. So it has got some flavor in it. It's very different. You refer to the cottage pie or the shepherd's pie, which is the Western version. It's very different. But if you look at the technique or the way it is done, maybe there is some similarity. So that is there. So I would say so we have what would you say, the other
Caramel custard?
caramel custard. Certainly we have the caramel custard, we have the bread pudding. But I don't trust Purna, it was Ria who said the daily diet is very simple. It is only on a feast day. We don't have festivals. Christians, we have what we call the feast day. And I remember as a little child, in the Bible, it said the fattened calf is, it was not the cow, it was the calf, I would say. The
Yes, the
male
fattened
of the
calf.
calf was butchered, and a certain portion was given to the manpower or to the staff who worked with my father or my grandfather, and then the rest of it is kept in the family. And breakfast would be a pancake called kallappam, which is a rice pancake made with toddy and a lot of coconut in it. And breakfast, the first meal for the feast of on a Christmas or an Easter, the first meal was always served. The day starts by serving the food for the staff before the family eats. All the staff sit around the veranda and they have banana leaves laid out. And my father would serve the pancake, the appam, and then my mother would pour the meat curry, which is always the beef curry, which was but again, what I would like to highlight, one of our recipes, what we call the malli charu. I do not know if Musa, you have it, the malli charu. We have
Yes.
something, a meat curry, a curry. The base is a malli, which is a coriander base. We have coriander, and always the portion I often tell is 1, 2, 3. So 1 is the turmeric, 2 is the chili, the 3 is the coriander, and then we put pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. The main spices in our diet is the cinnamon, pepper, and cloves. So we very lightly use cardamom, fennel. It's very subtle way. Of course, if I make a biryani, my combination for the garam masala is exactly like the way Musa said. It's exactly the same. Even I too only sun-dried. I never roast it in the heat. It's sun-dried. And I make my garam masala for the year during the summer time, the hottest time of the year. I have sheets in steel plates. I put all my masala in the sun and I powder it before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Around 2 o'clock, I powder so the spices are really heated up by the sun. So of course we do adapt other ingredients, but traditionally Syrian Christian food, what I would like to highlight is a very subtle, very subtle flavor, very mild flavor, and I think it is because of the Western influence in our cuisine.
That's wonderful. Very, very interesting. Mrs. Paul, thank you. Thank you for that insight. I'm now going to ask Purna about a little bit about how the Chinese adapted to the Bengali palate. In Delhi, we have something called Chinjabi. So it's
Yes.
a Chinese cuisine made for the Punjabis in Delhi, and it's called
Yes.
Chinjabi. And you'd be surprised how many Chinjabi restaurants there are in Delhi catering to the Punjabi palate of the Chinese food. So,
Yeah.
so tell us a little bit about how the Chinese adapted to the Bengali palate.
Okay, so there are manifold versions of this. Okay, the best thing that I would say is that there are a lot of specific condiments that originated in Kolkata Chinese food. One of them is the Kolkata chili sauce, which is the green chili sauce. Okay, so a lot of people say that why when I go to other parts of Southeast Asia, to let's say Hong Kong, to the Chinatown in Bangkok, we get to see so many other things, but why don't I get to see the chili sauce? So there is a little funny story here, and that involves Pao Chong, which is one of the major sauce brands from Kolkata, which is absolutely 100% by the Chinese community of Kolkata. It's run by the Leek family, and Janice, I think she's the fifth generation now. She's one of the people who mans it. But what she told me was that her grandfather was making a version of the Chinese chili bean sauce, which was the Dowanjian, if I'm not mistaken. But the local Bengalis didn't really like it much. They were like, no, this is not working for us. So he was actually making a lot of different batches of chili sauce and just trying it out with the locals, saying, okay, tell me how this tastes like. And then suddenly one of those formulas worked. And because it worked and it gained importance during the 80s and 90s, when a lot of women in Kolkata decided to take up the jobs and, started working as a two-parent family, the concept of nuclear family started growing. You would see there was a little bit of a rise in self-employed people who would start these tiny roll and chow mein shops on the street. And for them, the quality of the ingredients weren't great and the style was absolutely not great. But the chow mein became like a major street rage. Before that, it was always found in these tiny Chinatown restaurants or in the big restaurants of Park Street. But this possible point of time was the time when the Bengali entrepreneurs started their take on what is known as Chinese food. So there was a lot of Bengali street food influence on Chinese food. And this kind of gave rise to two major sauces. One of them, the original Chinese people would really frown upon, and that is ketchup. Okay, so people put ketchup on everything, including the chow mein. And the other thing that they put on was the chili sauce, because typically Bengali people, our taste buds are really suited to a sweet, sour, hot palate, like a balance of all three. And the ketchup gave the sweetness, the chili sauce gave the heat, and the salty part and the umami part came from the profuse use of Ajinomoto in the food. Again, something that an original Chinese restaurant will probably frown upon nowadays. So if you look at the kind of restaurants that were prevalent before that, you would see typically restaurants which were situated in Benting Street were considered to be authentic Chinese restaurants, along with a few places in Park Street. One of them, the oldest one, I think, was this place called Waldorf. And Waldorf was actually legendary in its own way. It did have a really cool Chinese European influence, and typically the influence that they had was a anglicized version of Chinese, because typically the first people to start eating Chinese food outside their own food was more than the Bengalis were the Britishers and the Anglo people. And of course, because the Anglos and British were also doing a lot of jobs under whom the Bengalis were, so they were actually, let's say, if you go with your boss, will you be saying, no, I won't eat this? You won't. You will have to say, Han, let's eat this. And after you eat this, you realize it's quite decent, it's nice, and then you start, consuming it with everyone else. So I would say that that's also how the Chinese food started getting uh, uh, popular. Also, one other, the Bengal Club, iconic, the Calcutta Club, they serve Chinese food. A very famous scene from a 1980s movie called Obobodhu Sundari. It's a Bengali film, which has one of the most incredible Bengali icons of who's ever lived, Uttam Kumar, and a very well-known national level actress, Moushumi Chatterjee. And there's this story is like a modified Pygmalion. So what happens is Uttam Kumar, who's the teacher, he takes Moushumi Chatterjee, a street singer, to one of the clubs and introduce her to fine dining. And the first thing she looks at Chow Mein and says, "Oma Suta." So she was basically just looking at the threads and thinking they were just threads, and she was completely perplexed. Why would somebody eat threads? So it was a hilarious scene, but it kind of showed how initially Bengali middle class and lower class regarded these quote unquote exotic treats, because back then there was no media, there was no national television which would feature this kind of food. So the only exposure people would have is one-on-one, as in, you see it, you eat it, that's how. So Chinese community did have a lot of Bengali influences. If you see certain recipes in older Chinese restaurants, I would suggest one of them is, for example, if you go see, actually this is a relatively newer dish developed in 1970s, if I'm not mistaken, by one, I think, third generation Chinese person. Her son now is in YouTube. But what she did was she took one of her long-term thoughts about getting something completely different and making a recipe which was similar to a Cantonese pan-fried noodle. And the noodle that she made was absolutely simple, but it used a lot of local ingredients. Like in summertime, you will often see very thinly sliced a potol or parwal, which is pointed gourd. And that's a completely Bengali addition. You will not get this probably in China. You will get something similar. You will get a winter melon in China, but I don't think you will get pointed gourd in China. So, these are actually great examples of how Bengali cuisine sort of influenced. And of course, the iconic chili chicken was created here. And I am absolutely sure no one in the mainland China has ever heard of chili chicken, Chinese bhel. Chinese bhel is like a question mark to all of us. The Gobi Manchurian was developed in Mumbai by one of the I think Mr. Wang, if I'm not mistaken, and Mr. Nelson Wang, if I'm not mistaken, and he was also of the Chinese Kolkata community. And when he was asked to make a recipe, he kind of got stuck for names and said, okay, so ideally the thing is, if you're looking at this food, the two influences you will get is the Hakka community and of the Cantonese community. These two communities, because they were one of the first pioneers who would come here and settle down, the Hakkas were, of course, they came in later than the Cantonese, but because they were way too many in number and also much more interested in working at any level whatsoever, their food did get incorporated sort of into our culture very easily. So we do have the Hakka noodles, which is basically nothing but a chow mein. So in China, you have two versions of noodles in general, or rather the mian. One of them is called a chow mein and the other one is called a lo mein. The lo mein being noodles tossed in a sauce where the sauce is absorbed slowly and it is not stir-fried over very high heat. And chow mein is essentially how to fry the noodles. Okay, so it's essentially a frying noodles versus, let's say, braising noodles, right? That's the word. So these things got incorporated in Indian cuisine because of their acceptability and their willingness to have a lot of familiar ingredients as well as a little unfamiliar touch, as in you are venturing out of your comfort zone but not too much, which is essentially how people can eat. Like if you get something which is absolutely unfamiliar to you, you wouldn't trust that food, would you? But if you know that this is just wheat, then you sort of lose that fear that you have inside. And so this is important because that's how the Chinese Indians sort of got into the mainframe of Kolkata. And definitely Kolkata has one of the biggest Chinatowns. Actually, it has 2 Chinatowns. And the area space is actually the highest between here to all the way to London. So we have the big one. And the numbers are dwindling, so we are very worried about that. But at the same time, we wish that.
Right. I think Purna is frozen again. So thank you so much, Purna, for that insightful information on the influence and the evolution of gobi Manchurian and chili chicken. I now come to Mr. Musa to talk about special occasions, as Mrs. Paul spoke about feasts and how feasts happen in their traditional homes. So my question to Mr. Musa is about a traditional wedding feast that includes a special brunch in the Mopla traditional household, when a mother-in-law organizes for her son-in-law with more than 70 dishes the morning after the wedding. So can you tell us a little bit more about this tradition and what are the dishes included in this huge spread after the wedding?
Okay. Before we start that, before marriage I was very thin, and after that,
Weren't we all?
40 days,
This is why I didn't get married.
supposed to go out anywhere, and eat. Literally say I ate like a pig. And you get up, the morning you get up immediately with your morning tea, morning coffee, bed coffee, what you call, will be boiled eggs and sauteed bananas. Because the breakfast, what you call brunch, will be ready only by 11 because all the dishes has to be ready.
Yes.
And it will be, all sorts of things will be there, fish, chicken, mutton, beef. And apart from all this, for the namesake, the table has to be adorned with a plate of ghee rice. Who is going to eat that rice at 11 o'clock when you have finished all that? So the rice has to come onto the table, then only the table, the spread is complete. Otherwise, it is an incomplete spread. And then again, you go and sleep. Automatically, you fall asleep. And you get up at 3 o'clock, the next feast comes. So that's how my fattening process started in my body. Now I really have to be very careful with food because otherwise I go out of shape. So as Laveen asked, our snacks, we have about more than 100 varieties of snacks. And we have quite a number of snacks made with bananas, umpteen number of snacks. And one of our main dishes we make during the eve of Ramadan, that is with the bananas and rice, small dumplings, which is called pidikari, which is a must, which you can eat with rice steamed cakes. So this morning brunch, there is not much to still say about that other than to tell you all that it is something very, very, very special so it is such a vast spread of things that you cannot find that kind of thing in any community. And anybody who eats that for 40 days will definitely become fat. And the fattening process will start from that. So that is what I want to say about that morning breakfast, which is you call brunch, because it is served at about 11 o'clock. And you do this for 40 days. Not 1 day, 1 week or 10 days. For 40 days, I'm not supposed to go to my house also. I have to be here only. At the most, I can go out for a walk and come back. And the 40th day, lot of people, your close relatives are invited. and it is a gala feast again. Gala feast again. In those days, now people are very health conscious, all that has disappeared. In those days, most of the people die very young, mainly because of this rich food they ate. No, I'm seriously saying, many people die young, and things have now changed. I may be one of the last persons to go through these kind of paraphernalias in the traditional systems. That way, I'm proud that I could get, but even though, and I survived. That is the main thing. I survived that, and I'm now going strong. And so to say about Mapla cuisine, our cuisine is very elaborate and very exotic. And one of the main things I want to share with Ria and Purna is, for your information, our recipes are minus. There is no pepper used in our cuisine, not even a small.
Yes.
We don't use pepper at all in our cuisine, whereas we use all the other spices. But pepper is totally absent, and the world famous pepper is known by the name Tellicherry black pepper. But still, we don't use pepper in our cuisine. That is.
May I ask why you do not use the pepper at all?
Yeah, pepper has this dominating feature, and like the way we use our spices, it is blended in such a subtle manner that it is a symphony of flavors. So if this pepper comes, that dominates, and all that will go.
It ruins the balance.
That is one of the reasons why we don't use basmati rice for our biryani, because basmati rice, when cooked, it is strong smelling.
Yes.
So when you make biryani with basmati rice, all the aroma of mutton masala will be
lost.
These are the two reasons why pepper and basmati is absent from our cuisine. And that is it. Fine? Okay?
Interesting.
Very interesting.
No,
very interesting.
And just one more thing about, earlier I said about the Portuguese influence. Then there is one dish in our cuisine, which is French influence, which is exact version of crêpe Suzette, which we call it Le Côte d'Arpent, which you will see it in our book. And when you see that, you will know what I was trying to say. It is purely because French was settled very close to Kalisheri, which is called Mahi. And Faiza is from Mahi.
Yes.
And, so that is one of the dishes I'm sure is the influence. It's pure version. Only thing is we have done slighter variations. Otherwise, it's exactly crêpe Suzette, but we don't flambe it. That is the only difference.
Okay.
Yeah. In short, these are the few things that is coming to my mind, and we have the time limit. We could share. We want to share with you and share with all the viewers. And it has been wonderful getting an opportunity to participate in this webinar, and nice meeting, of course, Loveleen and Nimi, our old friends. It is nice meeting Ria and Purna, and all of you are welcome to Kalisheri.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Musa. I have just a few more questions. Ria, there's a question for you. Your mother-in-law, Katie, was a legendary figure in the world of Parsi food and actually ran a kitchen at many of the clubs in Mumbai called the Gymkhana Grub. Can you tell us something about this club food culture and how it came about?
So the clubs are mainly a European concept. It was, to the best of my knowledge, started by British officers as as places for them to congregate and for them to socialize, because they were all away from home, and the club sort of recreated the English life, the British life in those little microcosms which were the clubs. And obviously the staff was Indian, and so the clubs are one space where the Indians picked up a lot of these foreign cuisines, and because the cooks learned these recipes and had to recreate them. So I think the clubs were one sort of a portal through which a lot of the European cuisines entered the Indian arena. Now, my mother-in-law catered to many clubs, no doubt about it. She ran the kitchens at various places like the Ripon Club, which is in South Bombay. She ran the kitchens at the PVM Gymkhana. She was at the Elphinstone Club for a while. And she also ran the kitchen for the Freemasons Hall at which is opposite Sterling Cinema. And at these places, I mean, most of the Bombay clubs at least were fairly dominated by Parsis. Parsis, because they interacted very freely, they did not have any interaction taboos. They did not have any commensality taboos. They could mix with people without, any fear of loss of caste. They could eat with any community because they did not have any caste restrictions, and they didn't believe that I can't accept food from X, Y, or Z. So this attitude, this lack of taboos, and this ease of interaction, uh, they absolutely used it to their advantage, and they mixed freely with the British. They adopted British ways very happily, and to the extent that they considered the queen their queen. So literally in Gujarati there is this expression which is Apri Rani, our queen. It's so they embrace the British style of life very happily. So the influence of the food is reflected in the tables at home also, and in the clubs where my mother-in-law ran. She would have a lot of these very classic English dishes like shepherd's pie. She would do the full roasts. She has done spreads for various events and commemorative days and stuff, where she has put up the full gamut of salads in aspic. She's done full roasts. She's had decorative salads with fancily cut vegetables and the whole display done. She's done cold salads where she has recreate where you like a fish salad, where the fish is mixed in mayonnaise, of course cooked fish, and then you reconstitute it in the shape of a fish with scales made out of thinly sliced cucumber slices. So it's very painstakingly and beautifully done. And there was a time, she used to say that, there was a time when my clients had large appetites and large pockets. So she also was lucky enough to have had the opportunity to travel around the world. My father-in-law was working with the merchant navy, and in those days navy officers could travel with family, and they could certainly take their spouses along. So my mother-in-law got to see a lot of the world, and she got to eat different cuisines and dishes from across the world. So when she started her career in the food business, she drew upon all these experiences. And since the Parsi clientele were very happy to eat all these fancy dishes, and especially if they were of European origin, I mean, these gymkhanas and places were like her stage. She had the opportunity and the audience for all this sort of fancy Western food. So not only the main courses, she would recreate these elaborate puddings and desserts and all sorts of things. And even on the daily menus, not just the party food, she would have, like, my husband tells me stories about the fridge would be stacked with little champagne glasses with jelly set in them, with a little
Wow.
squiggle of whipped cream and a cherry on top. So she certainly paid a lot of attention to detail. And in this process, she uh, has amassed a huge collection of cookery books, not just popular cookery books, but also cookery manuals for the catering, for the professional reader. So she would draw on these books and recreate as much as possible in the club. So even today, I mean, she's no more. Even today, if you see club menus, you will see a lot of these pies and dishes like a lot of egg based dishes, a lot of these caramel custards, and bakes and stuff, which are absolutely, they're just carried forward from literally from the times of the Raj. Because the whole
Yeah.
club concept and that whole style of life is very British. So
Yeah, and also I think these clubs and these even the army messes
yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
contributed a lot to the promotion of Anglo-Indian cuisine.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
That it did.
So my next question is on utensils. So I'm sure with each influence and each region bringing their own specific type of utensils would have contributed to the speciality of that cuisine. And I know in Kerala they use a certain type of um, certain type of dishes that are quite iconic. So my question is to Mrs. Nimi Paul. Any particular utensils that you think the community developed that was typically from Kerala or even Sri Lanka for that matter, because it's just across the channel?
I think you're talking about the, are you talking, is it about the appam because you said Sri Lanka?
Yes, the appam or also the utensils, you know, you have
Yeah, yeah.
very unique utensils that you don't find in the rest of the country. And also you use a lot of mud based, you know,
Clay pot.
clay pots, yeah.
Yeah, we do use a lot of clay pots. If I talk about the, if I like a little story, what I often like to share is about the clay pot. Now the floods are coming, right? Once I said when I was in school, I'm at home with my parents. I grew up in a plantation, the countryside rubber plantation, and the floods came. Those days also there were the floods, but it doesn't come. It was not as bad as this, but the roads are stopped, electricity goes, and my mother, she had the current goes, so she took all the meat from the freezer and she cooked it. I must have been about 10 years old, 11 years old, but still vividly remember. All the meat was taken from the freezer, marinated with just ginger and turmeric and vinegar, and cooked in the clay pot, and it was put into the fireside. Every morning and evening, the food used to be reheated. So, what is the benefit of the clay pot? One, it has a natural cooling effect. So you don't have to keep it in the refrigerator, and there's no chemical reaction because it's not a metal. So it cools naturally. The food doesn't go bad. Morning you heat it, evening again you heat it. So we use a lot of clay pot in our cooking. And I often keep that in mind when I want to preserve some food. For example, we need to have something called the Vindaloo, which is very, I won't say my Vindaloo is right and other Vindaloo is right, but it's a Portuguese influence where the meat is cooked with spices and the preservative is the vinegar. And I often make my Vindaloo in a clay pot and I keep it even today in my kitchen, though it's a modern kitchen, I have a huge collection of clay pots, and I warm the vindaloo every morning, every evening. So by 2 weeks, the vindaloo is like a pickled meat. No, it is not pickled. It is not very spicy. It's not very
Sounds so
no,
good.
because slowly, it's so good. And second, what I would like to say is about the clay pot. It absorbs what I often tell my guests, for example, it's a personal relationship with the cooking vessel. That's how I always talk. Because it could be because I love cooking. I go through the hardest phase, the happiest time. Once I'm in the kitchen, I just love being with my food and my cooking vessels. So there's a personal interaction between the cooking vessel and the person who's cooking.
Very true.
So it's beautiful.
True.
It's really good. See, if I use a Teflon pan, if I have a huge group of 30 guests for lunch, I would cook my mean molly or my fish pollichadu in my Teflon pan. But it's very impersonal. I don't need to worry about whether the fish is going to break up. It will remain exactly the shape and the form it went into the pan. But similarly, if I use a clay pot, it might stick to the pan, but the flavor is much better. So you can be impersonal with your food. You can be very personal with your food. You can
Right.
when it's very personal, you touch, it hurts, but it's a very intimate relationship. That's what the clay pot does to the food. It brings out the beautiful flavor, the texture, the flavor. That's what the clay pot is. But you have to be careful. We cannot use the pot that we use for the fish, for the meat,
Yeah.
what we use for the meat, for the prawn, what we use for the curds, for the sambar. Every pot you have to keep it separately because it's absorbing flavor. So if I make a mean molly, my mean molly is a very mellow, light colored dish. If I do it in the pot in which I make my mean patichadu, which is a fiery fish curry, my mean molly is going to have the, however hard scrubbing you do, you wash it well, in spite of the clay pot absorbs the flavor, and your mean molly will definitely seep out a little flavor of the mean patichadu into the meat. So we have to be careful.
Yeah.
The second very important cooking vessel we use a lot is the uruli. I would like to talk about the uruli, the metal, the bell metal. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's so beautiful. But today in most of the Kerala homes, it's used for decorative purpose. It could be because it's so heavy to use. Heavy. Everyday cooking, it's heavy. And your kitchen staff may say, bye madam, you can do all the work by yourself. I cannot work with you because scrubbing a urli every day is not practical. But I can assure you, just like the clay pot, you cook in an urli, it doesn't stick to the pan, it retains its temperature, it's a never fail. But what I need to cook in a clay pot, I cannot cook in an urli. If I want to do a dry cooking, if I want my food to be dry, I have to use a urli. If I want to keep my food moist and soft, I have to go for my clay pot. So depending on the recipe, we change our cooking vessels. Yeah.
That's beautifully put, and what philosophy behind it. It's just so wonderful.
Yeah, it is there. It is there. I definitely would say, when you cook in a clay pot, it's just beautiful, the texture. And if I have leftover food, I keep it in my clay pot. I can assure you tomorrow the food is not going to go bad. Even if I any curry, huh? Because it has a natural cooling effect, and the flavors improve when you cook in a clay pot.
Yeah, even in popular cuisine, I think the biryani is also cooked in a clay pot. Am I right, Mrs. Musa?
No. Biryani is never cooked in an earth pot, but there are special, if you want to cook it on a large scale, there are special biryani vessels, which is again made of copper, mostly made of copper, but never in an earthen pot. Earthen pot we use only for making fish dishes, seafood dishes. But otherwise we use metal dishes for meat and other things. Yes.
Right.
So lovely. I need to share about the wedding, about Kerala wedding.
Yes, please tell us.
Since Musa got the opportunity, I'm going to put my words forward.
Please tell us. Please tell us.
We talk about the clay pot. We have a curry called the mean patichadu, which is like the fish cooked. And like in Syrian Christian or Christian homes, I would say, especially in a certain community, the reason for the family to get together. Of course, unlike the popular cuisine, the Syrian Christian is much more mellow. We are low. We're not I don't know what word to use. It's in a more subtle way we celebrate everything, but we have the gathering where what we would call the open house. Especially the ladies get together one day, 3 days before the wedding. We do what we call the mean patichadu. So the fish is cut into cubes. It's not huge pieces, small pieces of fish. Lots and lots of onions are peeled, lots of ginger is peeled, lots of garlic is peeled, and all the family get together. We sit around and you peel it. And there's a paste made with chili powder. This chili powder is ground to a paste. And the onions are fried, taken off. The ginger is fried in coconut oil, taken off. Green chilies are fried, taken off. Garlic is fried, it's taken off. And then we do what we take the clay pot, a huge clay pot, and then we do what is called the layering.
Okay.
So the first layer, we oil the clay pot. The pot is well oiled. And then the first layer, we put some chili paste. And then over that, we put one layer of cubed fish, and then goes in. And the fish is not a bony fish; it's steaks of fish because it has to be kept. It's not used for bones; are not put in. And then over that we put fried onions, fried garlic, fried ginger, fried green chili, fried lots of curry leaves. And I missed out on one important ingredient, the kodampuli, the kukum that we use a lot for our
Yeah.
cooking.
The
Unlike
souring ingredient.
the southern ingredient, unlike in the like Musa, you must be using tamarind. We use kodampuli, which is very typical of the central Travancore. We soak the kodampuli in water and that is poured over. Only the liquid is poured, the tamarind is not put, and layers and layers and layers of we put this, and finally the last layer is of the onions, and then we seal it well, and then it's kept on a very low flame and cooked slowly. And then the pot is covered with a muslin cloth and kept aside. It's opened only the second you have the special ceremony where all the family gets together, and that day this is opened and it's served to the guests.
How fascinating.
Yeah.
So the whole family gets together and cooks this dish.
Cooks
That's
together. This dish is
so interesting.
It's dish. Yeah.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that story. I'm going to ask Purna a question now. Purna, tandoor is attributed to the Afghans and Persians, and also they also have mobile ovens now in Delhi from many years. That you see those vendors making naan khatai cookies in the north. They come in their cycles with their mobile ovens and they make these cookies, which we call naan khatais. So did the British bring the oven to India, or was it the early Europeans like the Portuguese or the Dutch? How did the bread, the first bread, how was the first bread made? What kind of ovens were we using?
Can you hear me?
Yes, your connection is a little poor, but yes, we can hear you. Oh dear, we've lost you, Purna. I think you switch off your camera and your connection might be better. We've lost her. Sorry about that. Okay, so when she comes back, we can maybe ask her this question again. In the meantime, I'm going to do a quick fire round about what are the key contributions to Indian food by the Portuguese, Dutch, British, Parsis, Arabs, etc. So I know the potatoes were brought by the Portuguese.
Yes.
Purna, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, so can you...
Technically, there are a few different things here. Definitely, the Portuguese would be credited by bringing breads, etc. But it's not just the Portuguese. The Dutch brought their version of bread. The British brought their version of bread. Whoever came to India, they did learn how to make bread.
Oh, audio is not clear at all.
Please, we can't hear you. Sorry, we can't hear you, Purna. So I'm sorry, we'll have to cut that short and we will probably take up that question later. But in the meantime, if you could just name one thing that you think the foreigners gave us, which Indian cuisine would be incomplete without. So, Mrs. Paul, would you like to say something?
I didn't follow you. I'm distracted.
I'm just saying the contribution of the foreigners to our cuisine, without which our cuisine would be incomplete. Any one thing you think they gave us? Potatoes, maybe? I don't know.
So chilies, potatoes, tomatoes, all are thanks to the Columbian Exchange.
Yes.
So we've had them for about 350 years. So if you actually see the temple cuisines and if you see the Vratka Khana, if you just examine what is allowed and what is not. Now in the old Prasad recipes, you won't find these ingredients. Why don't you find them? Because they weren't there. Also, the converse side of it is, if you see most of the what is allowed in Vrat Ka Khana, you see sabudanas allowed, potato chips are allowed. This is, you will notice that these are all later ingredients. So they were not disallowed because we didn't know about them. So what came later suddenly gets allowed. So in that sense, the Columbian exchange really made an impact. And literally what we consider for most cuisines in India, I will say most, not all, is that, you know, aloo, tomato and mirchi. These are like the foundations of all our pantries, nearly all our pantries. And so
Yeah.
if you think, okay, you know, these are not there. So this is, I think, for, if you think pan-Indian cuisine ke liye, these are seriously important. As far
Right.
as Western India is concerned, the Portuguese contribution of vinegar is huge, because vinegar is very popular down the western coast, you know, from Gujarat to the south in some form or the other. So the Parsis also have, literally they have their own brand, you know, their favorite brand, and that is manufactured by Parsis. It's a version of sugarcane vinegar. In Goa, you have the toddy vinegar. Further south, I'm not sure what particular kind of vinegar is used, but it is used. Even the Kodampuli that Paul Ma'am was talking about is a version of, you know, I mean, it's called a vinegar. It's not technically a vinegar, but it's called so. So this whole concept of using vinegar is definitely a European contribution to at least the western coast. Uh, so many
Yeah, I
things, you
think,
know,
yeah. So
even
I think you've kind of summed it now. So our key pantry ingredients like potatoes, onions, and chilies,
onions
thanks
nahi.
to foreigners.
Potatoes, tomatoes, not
So
onions.
potatoes, tomatoes, and chilies are
Chilies.
thanks to the foreigners, and we have a lot to thank them for, including
I
visitors.
have
So
to
I think we will end this conversation now. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. and Mrs. Musa, Mrs. Paul, and Rhea, and Purna. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you so
sorry,
much.
Purna,
Thanks for
you're.
having us. It's okay. I just want to finish by just saying that most Indian contribution we have is so sweet. Because none
We
of
can't
the
hear you, Purna. Sadly, we can't hear you. So I'm sorry. We'll have to end this now. Thank you all for joining us and sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll end this webinar now. Thank you.
Thank you.